Good afternoon. So welcome to the last panel presentation in the 15th Annual Central and Southwest Asian Studies Conference. We welcome you and we feel honored and privileged to have all of you. This has been quite a successful conference with a packed house last night with former Ambassador John Limbert. And we had a wonderful radio interview today, and one of the issues that was brought up, of course, was the origins of terrorism and political Islam and where the roots of this phenomena is. And whether it's Islamic or whether it's just terrorism, which carries the adjective Islamic attached to it. So in order to ask some of these questions and also to ask that famous question which came up after the attacks of 9/11, why do they hate us? Who are they? Do they hate us, or is it something totally unrelated to us, at least originally, and it's embedded in the teachings of religion? We have two outstanding speakers. We have Mark Metcalf, who has been working now for many months, it seems. Mark, how many months or years now? Over a year now, on this wonderful project that he calls it an absurdly brief and awkwardly truncated history of global jihad. I've had the honor and privilege of working with Mark and following his research project. So Mark Metcalf will start, and then we will follow with a very unique and extremely brilliant scholar and analyst, my very good friend. You should not leave me now. You should stay put. Professor Michel Valentin, who is a member of the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literature, and indeed a theorist and analyst of films, but also theory. And we are really pleased and privileged to have Michel with us as well. So Michel will follow. Each of them will have about 30, 35 minutes, and then we will stop. I might have a few concluding remarks as a discussant. I will try to shut up as much as I can, and then we will open it up to questions from all of you, and we look forward. There's a microphone there, so by all means, go to the microphone and ask any questions you might have. So with no further ado, help me welcome Mark Metcalf.
Thank you, Professor Sia. An absurdly brief and awkwardly truncated history of global jihad is the title just of this piece today. The piece I've been working on for a year, I've arrogantly titled A Brief History of Global Jihad. It was to steal from Stephen Hawking, whose attempt was to explain time to the layman. I'm attempting in what is about 200 pages now, it started out as 60, to explain global jihad briefly to the layman. And I'll attempt to sort of skim across the tops of the waves and give you an absurdly brief and awkwardly truncated, because I'll just stop when I've come to the end of my time, history of global jihad. See if I figure out how to work this. I can't. Do I have to press that? Okay, I have to press it over there. 26,171 bombs the United States has dropped in 2016 alone. Who did we drop them on, and who is our enemy? I want to make it work with this. No, I have to do this. Do you know how that works? I'll just do it here. The vast majority of them were dropped on these countries: Libya, Somalia, the Federal Republic of Somalia, the Republic of Yemen, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, the Syrian Arabic Republic, the Republic of Iraq. 5 Arabic-speaking nations, plus Afghanistan, where the language is Pashto or Dari, an Indo-Iranian language, and Pakistan, where the language is Urdu, a Persianized version of Hindi. All 7 are sovereign nations. All have constitutions like ours, inspired by ours. All with populations who identify as Christian, Jewish, and Islamic, but each is primarily thought of as Islamic. In wars that have not been declared, who is the enemy? Now, to be fair, we have been in an undeclared war with Afghanistan for 16 years. We have been in an undeclared war with Iraq since invading it in 2003. Both wars have been declared victories by some, debacles by others, and endless nightmares and stalemates by others. Now, as you can see, the vast majority of these bombs have been dropped on Iraq and Syria, where we have been fighting ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, also known as ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or the acronymic for the Arabic name, DAESCH, Daesh. Now, it is impossible to calculate the number of civilian and military casualties. In fact, it is impossible usually to distinguish between the civilian and military casualties. But suffice it to say, it is impossible to calculate the number of dead and wounded administered by the 26,171 bombs that we dropped in 2016. And remember, that is just 1 year of the so-called War on Terror, which is another undeclared war on a vague and difficult to distinguish enemy. The War on Terror was declared in that it was announced by President George W. Bush on 20 September 2001 in an address to Congress. The reason for that declaration was this event. 19 men, 15 Saudi Arabian citizens, 2 from the United Arab Republics, 1 each from Egypt and Lebanon. 19 men turned airliners into bombs and flew 2 of them, still full of jet fuel, into the World Trade Center. Another one into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. 1, United Flight 93, crash-landed in Pennsylvania because of the actions of passengers who chose their own deaths over the deaths of unknown numbers of strangers if the plane had reached its destination. The action was designed and perpetrated, as we all now know, by an organization called Al-Qaeda, which means in Arabic, the base, led by a very wealthy Saudi whose citizenship had been revoked, named Osama bin Laden. 2,996 people were killed in the 3 attacks. More than 6,000 were injured. The psychology of the entire nation, our entire nation, was changed. Whatever had amounted to foreign policy before 9/11 changed completely. Within days, we were feverishly at war with, well, with whom? Al-Qaeda had attacked us in the name of Islam, but also in the name of anti-imperialism. It openly declared jihad against what the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979 in Shia Iran had called the Great Satan, the United States of America. Why do they hate us, as Professor Kia said? That's what everyone asked. Why do they hate us? And many, many who knew nothing about Islam or about Muslims, many decided on the spot, if they hate us, then I hate them. There are those who say that Americans are hardwired for violence. And if you look at the number of deaths by firearms in this country every year, and if you think about 3 bombs every hour in 1 year dropped on strangers, and if you understand that that year is not an anomaly, and if you think about what we choose as our popular entertainment, then those people may have a case. So if they hate us, then I hate them easily turns into war. A war on terror costs a lot of money. In the first year, 2001, we budgeted $31 billion, that's 9 zeros. That's in 2002, 59.1 billion. In 2003, 111.9 billion, and on and on and on. Someone can do the math, but it has been said that the war on terror has added $2 trillion to the national debt. That's 12 zeros. Now that's money we no longer have for education, to repair and rebuild infrastructure, to create jobs, to advance scientific research, for higher education, such as at this university, to pay teachers' salaries, for health care, for artistic endeavors, for self-expression, to solve the problems that face ordinary people every day. That is money down the drain, or more aptly, up in smoke. This is an artistic installation in Pakistan. That's a photograph laid out on huge amount of paper, probably 100 yards long, near a village in Pakistan in an area that has been heavily hit by drone strikes. It's an attempt to say to the people who are pushing the button on the drones, who are safely in Nevada, most of them, that there are children here and that they should take that into account before they push that button. Now, according to the website The Balance, in an entry dated 23 March of this year, written and researched by Kimberly Amadeo, the real cost of the war on terror is not just what it has added to the debt, it's also the lost jobs that those funds could have created. Every $1 billion spent on defense creates 8,555 jobs and adds 565 million to the economy. That same $1 billion given to you as a tax cut would have stimulated enough demand to create 10,779 jobs and put $505 million into the economy as retail spending. $1 billion in education spending adds $1.3 billion to the economy and creates 17,687 jobs. So, what are we fighting? Who are we fighting? And I sure hope it's worth it. To many, the enemy is Islam, as our current president identifies it, radical Islam. He's openly called for a Muslim ban, has signed 2 presidential directives to stop immigration of people from, at first, 7 Muslim countries, and in the second instance, 6 Muslim countries. Not exactly the same countries that we bombed. Afghanistan and Pakistan were replaced on the no admittance list by Sudan and Iran. Again, both Muslim countries. The project I've been working on for the past year is to try to track the ideology of Islam from its origins in a little village in the Hijaz region of the Arabian Peninsula. That's Mecca, Medina. That's the western region of Saudi Arabia. Track the ideology from its origins there to what I call single soldiers who in the past several years have, well, this is going to be awkward, have perpetrated violence on Americans and Europeans, sometimes in very organized ways, but often in equally destructive ways, but highly personal and independently motivated, seemingly spontaneous ways, such as the pressure cooker bombs in Boston at the Boston Marathon in 2013, the shootings in San Bernardino in 2015, the killings at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando in 2016, attempted bombings in New York and New Jersey in 2016, and a young Somali man who drove his car into a group of students in Columbus, Ohio, and then began slashing at people with a butcher knife, also in 2016. So, the first question I had to ask myself is, how did we get from there, from a simple merchant in a small town in the Hijaz region of Arabia, a 40-year-old reformer, the Bernie Sanders of his day, a man who openly eschewed violence and sought the liberation of women, to hear. "16 people dead, hundreds injured, including many who lost arms and legs, lying bloody in the streets of Boston or of Nice or of Istanbul or Lahore, Pakistan, or Paris." The other question is, the probably unanswerable question, is violence inherent in the core values of Islam, or is Islam being used, whether consciously or unconsciously, as a cover, as it were, for state-sponsored terrorism, for political opportunism in the pursuit of what some might call enlightened self-interest, or as a counter-revolutionary tool against what is perceived as the threat of U.S. military and economic imperialism, and or, amongst the flawed and struggling faithful, is Islam simply an excuse used to shuffle off this mortal coil, which has become a consummation devoutly to be wished as a result of endless poverty and despair and abuse? When feelings of helplessness and hopelessness become chronic, religion and faith are often the last refuge. And Islam promises a beautiful paradise to the faithful. Now, in the beginning, there was the Word. That middle-aged merchant that we mentioned earlier went for a walk up a hill near his home, sat in a cave for a while, meditated, and came down the hill with the Word in his mouth. Thousands of words crammed into his mouth until they overflowed and flowed forth upon the people of that little crossroads, that little oasis, that intersection of many manners of worship that was Mecca in 610 CE. For 23 years, the words flowed. More and more people came to listen, and many stayed. Some traveled on and told of the great and beautiful words that came from the mouth of this ordinary man, divine words, the words of the one true God, the God of Christians and Jews, spoken by the angel Gabriel into the mind and out of the mouth of a humble and pious man, an Arab man. The people believed it was the word of God because that is what the man told them. The man had always been believable and trustworthy. He was a likable fellow. The man was Muhammad, and today he is known as the prophet, the last prophet. He came, as prophets before and after him came, with the Word. And the Word became the Quran. Muhammad was, in the beginning, essentially a political activist, a nonviolent revolutionary. He lived at a crossroads of trade routes amongst a people, a tribal, polytheistic people, prone to violence, relatively uneducated and unsophisticated, certainly by the standards of the empires to the north and the west and the east of that desert peninsula, but a proud and extremely proud people. They were also a brutal, unforgiving people in a brutal and unforgiving landscape. It was a culture that buried female children alive, if there were too many females, abandoned orphans, worshiped the accumulation of wealth, and ignored the poor and less fortunate. They believed absolutely in the power of the sword. Muhammad saw this and thought it was wrong. He sought to change it. The only tool he had was the word of the one true God, the God of the Christians and the Jews, and now the God of Muslims, the followers of Islam, the God he believed of all people, everywhere. He preached peace and harmony. He preached fairness. He preached generosity and sympathy for the underprivileged and less fortunate. He preached submission to the one true God. The meaning of the word Islam in Arabic is surrender. He preached and a few listened. At first only his extended family and a few others, but more would come. Today it is estimated that there are as many as 1.8 billion Muslims on earth. It's the fastest growing religion on earth. Now, most of his neighbors and the merchants of Mecca who managed this crossroads, who managed the Kaaba, That's a representation of the early version of the Kaaba, which housed over 300 idols representing the many gods and goddesses that were worshipped by the people who traveled the wastelands. His neighbors put up with him for almost 12 years until they felt their livelihoods threatened by his talk of one God. Their prosperity, see, depended on many merchants with many gods stopping at their crossroads to pray, eat, drink, and be merry. That's the Kaaba today, surrounded by the faithful. Now, in 622, they had had enough and they plotted an assassination. Muhammad fled to the north to the town of Medina. His followers, perhaps 100 or less at the time, followed him. This flight is the momentous event in the history of Islam. It is the moment they chose to begin the Islamic calendar. Everything before then did not exist in time. Everything from that moment on is Islamic time. It's a lunar calendar. It is, the move to Medina is the galvanizing event in the politicization of Islam. Having been persecuted and essentially run out of town, the small group of true believers banded together and they began to fight back. Those who had been the other stood up on their hind legs and sought an other for themselves. The tone of the surahs, the verses of the Quran and the words that were spoken by the angel Gabriel through Muhammad changed markedly once he arrived in Medina. They began to identify Islam as a system of governance. They formed an entity, a state. They unified. They found allies. They wrote a constitution. And whereas our Constitution imagines a society that might be created through constant work and vigilance, the Constitution of the early Muslims was written in real time, for real times, to manage real events. It was written to organize, to clarify, and to guide ordinary men in a way of living together as a community. And it was coming directly out of Muhammad's mouth from God, which gave it a finality and an authenticity that any man-made document would have lacked. Now, when Muhammad died, he left behind his memory and his recitations, which had been memorized by some and were within a few years written down and became the Quran. The ways of the Prophet, the stories of his life, were also gathered together and were written down and are known as the Hadith. Now, the thing about any word, even divine words, is that, there we go. The thing about any word, even divine words, is that they will have a different meaning to different people at different times, and so the words of Allah, the Quran, and the ways of the Prophet, the Hadith, have come down through 1,400 years, interpreted in different ways by different schools of thought. The Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, and the Hanbali are the four existing schools of thought in the Sunni branch of Islam, which is the branch of Islam with which approximately 85% of Muslims identify themselves. The other 15% of Muslims are Shia. Shia Muslims form the majority of those who live in Iran. Shia also live in Iraq, Lebanon, parts of Yemen, Kuwait, and Bahrain. The Alawites, the tribe of Bashar al-Assad of Syria, are Shia. Now, we will concern ourselves here primarily with the Sunni, though both Sunni and Shia have resorted to terrorism. It's been said that the difference between Sunni and Shia terrorism is that the Sunni cut off your head, while the Shia use an electric drill to drill holes in your head. The Shia are apparently more accepting of modernization than the Sunni. Of the four Sunni schools of jurisprudence or legal thought, the one that bears the most investigation here is the Hanbali school. It is the smallest. It was the last to develop. It is the most austere, the most rigid, and one school that aggressively resists modernization and embraces an originalist way of interpreting the Quran. It is the Hanbali school and the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah, a 13th century Hanbali scholar and activist, that have had the most direct influence on Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab of Saudi Arabia. Now, the Hanbali school has even at times denied the existence of the other three schools. It is the most violently opposed to Shia Islam and to the Sufi branch of Islam, which explores a more spiritual, perhaps mystical way of thinking about one's relationship with Allah. Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab was born at the beginning of the 18th century in the Najd region of Saudi Arabia, the central region of the peninsula. That's Riyadh and over here. It's the most desolate and isolated region of that desert wasteland. He was the son and brother of respected Hanbali scholars in that part of the world, and it is important to remember that that part of the world had been overlooked by the invasions from both the West and the East, the invasions that started with the Crusades of the 11th century and the Mongol invasion from the 13th century, and continued with the encroachments of Europe by Europe and after the Industrial Revolution began, and on through the expansion of British and French colonialism, and then the American version of economic and cultural imperialism that began to grow after World War I. It's a process that's known and feared today, both by the right and the left, as globalization. I clicked that slide too early. Al-Wahhab studied the works of Taymiyyah, Ibn Taymiyyah, in Mecca and Medina, also in Basra, all three towns that he was eventually asked to leave because of his rigid interpretation of the Quran, which flew in the face of the more liberal schools that dominated in those areas. So he returned to his father's village in the Najd, full of the fervor of righteous belief in the original version of Islam as stated in the Quran and the Hadith, and followed by the first three generations of Muslims. And as now interpreted by al-Wahhab himself. He had the extra motivation of having been spurned by the other parts of the Arab world. Now, at this point, fortune shone on the face of Abd al-Wahhab. He met and made an alliance with an ambitious tribal leader named Muhammad bin Saud, and together they established the first Saudi state. Now, it was an alliance that was to grow in the traditional Arab Bedouin way through intermarriage and through conquest, political ambition bound together by faith in much the way that it had been articulated when the Prophet and his companions had faced their world and their oppressor in 622 CE in Medina, when Islam had determined its first political identity, when it stopped running and turned to fight. For almost 2 centuries, the Wahhabis and the Sauds continued to live in relative isolation in the Najd, with occasional excursions to the west to conquer and command the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. It was an alliance with its own ups and downs, as in any relationship. The most fundamental of the Wahhabis, the Ikhwan, or brothers, served the Saud family in battle many times, but occasionally they had to be reined in and even broken when it appeared that they might run amok across the Middle East and bring undue attention, militant attention, from the stronger, richer nations like the Ottomans of Anatolia and beyond. The Al Saud family never has seemed to have harbored a desire for world domination politically. Survival was their priority. It was a poor, forgotten wasteland. But the Ikhwan took jihad very seriously and believed it was their duty to Allah and to the Prophet to spread his word throughout the world. And even today, that is their mission, to convert or destroy. However, at the end of World War I, when the remapping of the Middle East by greedy European imperialists loath to let their empire die, and with the demise of the Ottoman Empire and the final collapse of the last Islamic Caliphate, and then Finally, with the discovery of oil, first in Iran, then Bahrain, and finally the mother lode, at the time the largest known deposit of crude oil in the world in Saudi or eastern Saudi Arabia in 1938. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as it is now known, became a phenomenally wealthy country and therefore a player on the world stage, strictly because the world was addicted to oil. See the USA in your Chevrolet or your Subaru, Toyota, Volkswagen, or Kia. Now, after World War II, when the utterly degraded economies and militaries of Europe turned the mastery of global hegemony over to the United States, and we entered into what was called, with a degree of perverse affection, the Cold War with the Soviet Union, wherein we set out to save the world for capitalism, or as we like to call it, democracy, with a big D. The Middle East, from North Africa, Egypt, through Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, on into Afghanistan and Pakistan, all became pawns in our own version of the great game that had been played out over much of the same geography by Great Britain and Tsarist Russia through the 19th century. I think I've outrun my time, and so I'm going to just stop here. I actually wrote that down. The story of Islam and its betrayal is far too vast and complicated for an afternoon. But I think it is important to remember that when they do this, 11 September 2001, and this, 15 April 2013, and this, 19 September 2016, and this, 28 November 2016, this is when the Somali-born student on the campus of the University of Ohio ran his car into students returning from Thanksgiving, exited the car and began slashing at them with a butcher knife, all because he feared for his life in this America made great again. Remember, as you think of what they've done to us, that we in the West have a long history of state-sponsored terrorism. Manipulation, exploitation, and war crimes. Oh, I forgot. There we go. That's the war crime. And we continue to use our might to manage what we will not understand. That's when we thought they were going to Korea, and they went somewhere else. Now, as far as my central question is concerned, the unanswerable question, is violence inherent in the heart of Islam, or is Islam being used as a mask for state-sponsored terrorism and personal vendettas? I don't know. I kind of tend to think that there is violence at the core of all monolithic religions. When you finally open your eyes and lift up your head from silent prayer and communion with your own one true God, you're bound to see another person also lifting up their head and opening their eyes, and the chances are pretty good that that other person is not going to necessarily agree with your vision of perfection, with your God. And at that moment, they become the other, as you become the other to them, and therein lies the tale. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. Now we move to our friend Michel. Michel, please.
Thank you. Sorry about that. The pleasure of Microsoft, which is a monopoly all over the world. Anyway, so is that fine? Yes. So our two presentations are very complementary. Mark focuses on the world, this phenomenon called terrorism in the world, and I'm more focused on terrorism in the West, and especially in Europe. but they are really complementary. What I'm going to read is parts of a book which is practically finished. I don't know what's something is never finished, and that's the problem, how to finish something which is always there and present and contemporary. I'm going to go against the grain, meaning I'm trying in this book, in this approach, to rebalance the perspective, which I think is too monocular, to if you want, univocal, meaning that it's them against us, them being, of course, as you said, evil, us being on the side of the good, of rationality, of fairness. And it's as most simple dichotomy, this is not true. So I'm trying to rebalance things and see, to put them and us in another context. Also one of the theses of my approach is holistic. I'm trying to look at terrorism, not as terrorism as such, but caught in a global text, if you want. So you can read terrorism as a text, the way you read society in a text, the way you read a text as a text, a literary text, or the way you read capitalism as a text. In order to do that, to avoid solipsism or personal opinions, you have to use tools. And we have tools. In fact, the tools of criticism invented in the 60s, 70s to try to make sense of a text, even a complex text, okay? And part of those tools, one tool I'm going to use, as you're going to see, is psychoanalysis. Not so much the psychoanalysis of Freud, but the post-psychoanalysis, like there's some famous thinkers and psychoanalysts who have reworked Freud after the 1920, especially after the Second World War, using linguistics, for instance, as a tool. So if you use that, then perhaps, I hope, we can understand more this phenomenon of terrorism, who for the most part are young men, and we'll go back to that. There are exceptions, of course, there are always exceptions. And in order to try to understand and not necessarily excuse, but and if you understand, you can try to prevent, although that is much more difficult. I would say that terrorism, I see it, and that intersects with what you just said, is a phenomenon, not only a global phenomenon, it's a product of globalization. 16 years after the United States declared war on terrorism, there seems to be no victory in sight. In fact, the toll in death and the economic financial loss, as you said, close to 1 trillion, now if you take everything into account, caused by terrorism is worse than ever across the globe. Why so much radical, fatal, unrelenting hate? It seems that only the Sphinx or God could provide answer. Common sense points at their murderous jealousy of our consumerism, their hateful resentment of our obscene enjoyment, or their medieval-like intolerance of our beliefs and lifestyle. Would be in us, Westerners. Maybe instead we should rephrase the question as such. What it is in our society which triggers the murderous rage and extremist violence of terrorists claiming fundamentalist religious allegiance. There are tools provided by critical and textual theory to help us. First, I'm trying to accelerate, a concept coming out of Deleuzian, Gilles Deleuze, philosophy called deterritorialization. You know, territory, territorialization, deterritorialization. If you want a mixture of estrangement, being outrooted, being decentered, it's a term which is more or less now used by American academics, perhaps not by journalists yet. Also, what I'm going to focus on is the fundamental, intimate, intersubjective and intrasubjective intertwining of the subject-other dyad. You know, subjectivity, according to Lacanian theory, is based on otherness. Otherness is part of subjectivity. The problem with otherness has to do with the position of that. The problem with the subject of the relation has to do with the position of otherness in your psyche and your unconscious. And remember, this relation between the ego and the other, covered up by the subject, which is like a bridge, an erection of identity, of posturing of the self, is linked to the relation between the mother and the father, or the other of the mother, if you want, with the incest taboo and the creation of forbidden taboos and incest taboo. And remember what Ambassador John Limbert said yesterday, that he thinks that many clerics in Iran are afraid of women. So, and it's interesting because that's, I think there's a key element there. There is a positioning of otherness linked to the other of the mother in certain, I wouldn't say Islamic situation, in certain religious situation, which totally warped the relation to otherness. And I'm going to try to explain that more clearly. So remember that. And throughout, if you look at Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the young men generally have a very bizarre relationship to women, or there's forced marriage, there's some case where they are sex slaves, but there is a very strange relation, which is not, you would say, balanced. Also, I would also emphasize the socio-economical sphere and condition linked to politics and history. Most of those terrorists, those who have especially perpetrated their acts in the West, in Europe, come from very poor background. That's across. There's a few exceptions, of course, again, but most of them come from dysfunctional family. They live in the suburbs, the projects in France or in Europe. The suburbs are where the poor used to live, or the workers, which were replaced by the immigrants in the 60s, 70s. So keep that in mind. It's like if you own the ghetto in America, except in the ghetto in America, they produce dysfunctional male and pimps, prostitution and drugs. They do that in France too, but there's also another production which is extremist jihadist or religious terrorism. So I claim that, with others, that human perversity, pathological and even psychotic behavior can be analyzed and can be understood using those tools. So if you want, those terrorists are not those monsters coming from Mars, whose behavior is impossible to understand, and they have to be just wiped out, crushed, or and the last item, I would say that Islamist terrorism is more a symptom of the West, of globalization and hypervirtuality. That's an important term. Hypervirtuality, hypervirtualism, and neo-capitalism. We'll go back to those terms. It's for instance, Michael Hart and Tony Negri in the work Empire, they speak of postmodern capital, neoliberalism, what we're under as a system, economical system, as a dialectical third stage of capitalism. So if you want, fundamentalist Islam and terrorism would be a symptom of a neo-capitalism itself. It cannot be separated at all. It's a product, if you want, a byproduct. Unwittingly, perhaps, so there's a reaction, and it's what I'm focusing on. Okay, so now, what is at stake in that weird exchange? I would say death. The whole postmodern problematics of violence and otherness boils down to one main thing, death, in the terrorist exchange. Death is what, if you want, capitalism, our society wants to avoid, wants to minimize, wants to evacuate. It used to be part of our culture through religion. It was highly symbolized, right? But there is a Western mode, capitalist mode of enjoyment, which try to erase, escape, or ignore death. And interestingly, terrorism brings back death. from the strange side of things, from the unwarranted side of things, but they bring back death. It's like this, as if it was the ultimate motive, if you want. What is behind those terrorist motivation? Well, first, as I already said, alluded to that quickly, the seemingly worldwide triumph of hegemonic capitalism, what the French call the pensée unique, the one-way type of way of thinking. You cannot have terrorism as such, the postmodern form, and you know what's postmodernism, it's the state of society post-1960, 1970, when the great narrative of explanation of the world kind of fell out of use or became obsolete. So postmodernism. Also, what is one of the causes of this terrorism, the globalization, violent excesses. While jump-starting middle class, globalization exacts its price. You can see a very interesting film there by Sissako, who is a Malian filmmaker, Bamako from 2006. It subverts nation-state autonomy, it aggravates economic inequalities, it generates social, cultural displacement and immigration. Another movie is Moussa Touré, The Pirogue, 2013 Senegalese movie, which shows how Senegalese are forced to immigrate in pirogue towards Europe. It takes several days and a lot of them disappear at sea. And why do they do that? Because the way the economic system works favors certain spheres, areas of the world, and not others. So it destabilizes culture, languages, traditional family values, especially paternal authority. It can be seen as good or bad, depending. It individualizes people, destroys, if you want, community, and especially tribal family feelings. And it pushes for, or promotes competition. It arouses feelings of inadequacy, the loser syndrome. It exists also in the West, of course. It put under strain and desocialize individuals, especially the individuals who feel they have no place. They are losers, they are not wanted. Another movie about that, Sissako is a Malian, Waiting for Happiness, 2002, where some immigrants are waiting in Mauritania, which is on the western coast of North Africa. They're waiting to be admitted back to Europe or to find a clandestine way to go to Europe to find jobs, mostly. Also, the causes of this terrorism, religious backlashes, identity politics. Remember, in the 90s, we all celebrate the collapse of Soviet Union, of communism, of the wall, but this collapse left a void. The void left by the left retreat, and it was replaced, this left retreat, this left which used to incarnate internationalism, universalism, class politics, etc. This retreat left a void, a vacuum. And in this vacuum, which also coincided with the individualization process of capitalism, this vacuum was moved on that open territory or left zone, was occupied by religious movement, religion, identity politics, mostly identity politics and religion. Why are the subject feeling deterritorialized? Why are they feel out of place, displaced, if you want? Well, already said that indirectly, competition, inadequacy, disintegration of families and cultural religious clashes, exacerbation of differences, and also that gives rein to another dimension in the psyche of human beings, the fantasy. So the fantasy dimension takes over. It's not constrained, limited by symbolic system, by cultural system. Also, you could say that terrorism is the product of otherness, this otherness which comes back in Europe right now in elections, which was present in the election in the US. What to do with the other? What to do with the presence of the other? What to do with the jouissance, the pleasure of the other, his mode of being, his mode of eating, his mode of regulating sexuality, which are different from culture to culture. So this otherness comes as a problem. Suddenly it erupts and becomes a problem. This type of absolutarianism is not totally new. Nothing is totally new. Like, for instance, there was a form of absolutarianism, if you want, in the 12th century, and Professor Kia knows about it. The old man of the mountain was a kind of a fanatic. In fact, he looked like Ben Laden in many ways, or Ben Laden tried to look like him, I don't know. Living in the mountain in an austere region of Iraq, I think, right? On Mount Alamut, in Iraq. And he launched on the Crusaders fanaticized men who were called Ashashin at the time. We gave the word assassin because they were high on hashish. And this man was the head of a sect, of if you want, a branch of Islam which became very specific and heretic in a certain way. He kind of fanaticized those men, those followers, and launched them also on the Muslim, on Saladin. And Saladin tried to use him against the Crusader. The Crusader tried to use him against the Muslim army of Saladin. But his name evoked terror, especially in the Crusaders. The Ashashin would sneak at night, or they would embed themselves in society and then suddenly slash their victim or their targets. Also, another origin of postmodern terrorism, if you want, in France in 1894, Émile Henry, a young anarchist, threw a bomb in the Café Terminus near the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris. This was the first modern terrorist act. It represented something new and frightening in the world, an attack on innocent people who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Henry considered the bourgeois sitting in the cafe, he was the terrorist, Terminus, guilty of their very existence. That is, the fact that you exist is a problem, has to be erased. That's new. So there is a kind of globalism. The global society is responsible. The fact that you exist is part of the problem. He was an anarchist. His aim was to destroy the French state. So it's, if you want, one of the first postmodern acts of terrorism. He used bombs. He would throw bombs on the crowd. The anarchists wanted to destroy the state by all means, striking the public, if you want, while in the postmodern jihadist terrorists want to not to destroy the state, but to create a state, a caliphate. So that's a bit different, if you want. Let me jump ahead. So what is new with postmodern fundamentalism compared to the one? Well, first, it's the hyper-virtual dimension, high-tech, and the hyper-virtual dimension, which is, if you want, the way postmodern society lose any referentiality to something material, to something concrete, and hyper-virtualize it. Social media, for instance, the contact with people is hyper-virtualized through the net in an electronic way. So they use that. That's totally new. And high-tech, of course. They, as Mark said, using airliners as missiles, hijacking airliners and detouring them from their normal task. I would jump here to flow and fluxes. Time is running. Postmodernism and terrorism are two facets, two sides of the same coin, if you want. They are part of what's called flow and fluxes in the world. You have the flow of capital, the flow of knowledge, the flow of control, the hyper-virtual flow of the internet and the net all over the world. And terrorism is part of that. For instance, thanks to globalization, you have the flow of drug trafficking, Remember the economy of Miami in the 80s and 90s was literally flourished because of the flow and flux of drug money. Illicit financial trafficking, offshore banking, etc. Human trafficking, immigration is part of it. You have illegal and legal, child labor, sex workers, etc., etc. The flow of troops and military aids or charity, or the Caritatis help from the West is part of that flow. And of course, the flow of fundamentalist terrorism. So without those flow and fluxes, which are facilitated by the hyperreal network, the network of hypervirtuality, there would be no postmodern terrorism as such. Now, let's go to more interesting part. The spirit of terrorism, is it a collective? One speaks, some analysts have spoken about collective psychosis. You know, a psychosis in a medical term is when, according to Lacanian theory, psychoanalysis, it's when there's no name of the other, the big other, the one which is opposed to the mother, the one which is linked to the unconscious, to incest taboo, and different prohibition, and puts limits. So in psychosis, you have there's no way the symbolic system, yourself, your I, your subject, can put a name and a law, a code on desire, right? It's in fluctuation. And I repeat, if you look at most of these young men, they have absolutely no father. Or if they do, we're going to see, they are dysfunctional, absent, they are dead, they died, they are obscene, or they didn't care. And they come from a family of several children, so 5, 6, 7. So you have an overdetermination, if you want. An affective, emotional overdetermination, which affects directly the way they deal with desire. Desire comes from the unconscious. They don't know how to react to it. Okay, that's very important. And what comes to plug that lack, that big lack, is a super other God, but an absolute God. In this case, it's Allah, an interpretation of Allah, but it's literally something which comes and plug this unknown territory, which is in you like a wound, if you want. And if you look at the French, Algerian, of course, all these young terrorists are multicultural. They come from different religion. I mean, from Islamist religion, from Islam, but often they don't practice, they forgot it, they don't care, or they were not raised in it. Here's the dissociation between first generation parents and second generation. And often they rediscover Islam or Allah, if you want, through radical clerics in jail or in some radical mosques. And of course, they are totally seduced by a discourse, a holistic discourse, or a totalitarian discourse which claims to explain their suffering and their lack of raison d'être. For instance, Kourachi, they were behind the Charlie Hebdo bombing in January 2015. There were two brothers. What is interesting also, the male bonding. When these young men are not wanted, they perceive they are not wanted, they have no essential reasons to be there. There's a void, they fluctuate. If they have girlfriends, it doesn't hold, it's very problematic. They often have, they question their own sexuality. Some have some homosexual tendencies, like Omar Mateen, the terrorist who attacked the Gay Pulse club in Orlando. He had homosexual tendencies, which of course was clashing with the sedimentation of the parental sedimentation, the traditional sedimentation in Islamic culture and prohibition. So you have already this extreme agitation, turmoil between a lack of the other, between what to do with one's desire, between the Western model, which is very permissive, where everything goes, if you want, compared to a traditional Islamist frame. And what's left, since the mother is sacred or locked in children, what's left is the group, the gang. And often the brothers work together. Remember the Tsarnaev brother, the Kourachi brothers. Brotherness or fraternity is a replacement, if you want, for this lack. But it doesn't stop there. Then from brothers, you have to have the gang. And the Kourachi brothers were, there was a gang in one of the area of Paris where all those young lost men would find each other, learn together under the guidance of one leader, read the Quran for the first time, and commiserate together. There was a togetherness, a being together, which totally didn't exist in the suburbs or in the projects. Another example. That's the reaction of the day after the attack on Charlie Hebdo. There was a few, of course, reaction in France. Relatively few. There was an attack on a mosque in Le Mans. It's jumping around. Okay, next case would be the Tsarnaev brother, who are, as you can see, what is their identity? They are Chechenian, Dagestan, Kyrgyz, Kalmykian, and American. The father had left, remember, so they have this, not only this very hybrid, conflictual identity, conjugated to poverty, of course, although they were going to school, but they were very poor, and this fluctuation, this affective, emotional, and sexual fluctuation. One had a girlfriend, but he had a very conflictual relation with her. Other example, that's a Tsarnaev brother, one of British Michael Reed, bomber, remember, 2001, just after 9/11. Himself also, same thing, totally lost, and was radicalized by this famous mosque in Great Britain where there was a radical cleric. Let's jump to, that's the Moroccan who was part of 9/11, but he was never in the plane, he was arrested after. The underwear bomber, that's an interesting case. He came from a rich family, but look at the device. The device. He was wearing these underwear which are rigged with bombs. You have something very interesting there from a psychoanalytic point of view. We don't have time to go into it. And he was from a rich family. Etc. So we could go down the, and here that's Abdel Salem, one of the terrorists who attacked the Bataclan. Since I have a few minutes left, let's go towards the end. I would speak about the inversion. There's quickly two things: the logic of ISIS and the inversion. What is interesting in psychosis, often you have hallucination. You think God speaks to you. Well, in the case of our young terrorist, it's as if God had to be reminded of his duty toward mankind. Allah is not doing his job. He's letting the unfaithful, the capitalist, the globalizationist, if you can say that, the Westerners take over. So ISIS, more than Al-Qaeda, in a way, reminds men, via men. ISIS reminds God, they speak to God, to respect the order of the universe. That is to say, to play God. ISIS people, terrorists, play God. They put God back in his place, in his godly place, a universe displaced by Satan, which is modernity. It's a symbol, America, the great Satan. put out of order by the infidels, the West, Christianity. It can also mean that those Muslim fundamentalists are angry against God. They are doing the job of Allah, what Allah should have been doing, for having given free rein to the infidels. In a way, ISIS violently reminds God of his task, duty towards mankind. In a way, ISIS is the instrument of God. And when someone becomes the instrument of a pure other, that's a sign of psychosis. When you say, well, I'm sorry, I have to kill you, but it's not me, I'm speaking in the name of God. There's a superpower, a superego, which tells me how to do it. So there's a very strange, interesting psychological structure which has not been very addressed that I'm aware of. If you want, ISIS jouissance is the arm of God by assuming the role and place of the ultimate paternal metaphor of the Lacanian big other. In a way, that's why life doesn't really matter. If you are the instrument of God, if you are the arm, the scimitar, or the bomb of God, in a way, life is just a means. The goal is dying. So in a way, suicide is inscribed into the psychotic path. Also, I will finish on that, the terrorism paradoxical inversion. The Orient and the Occident exchange missiles and missives of radical ideas, bombs, missiles. I speak of the Orient, the traditional Orient, but revised by globalization, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. And there is a paradoxical inversion at work, like tit for tat. So the codes are transgressed and they are reversed. For instance, Western secularism is opposed, is changed into extreme religiosity. Progressive liberal tolerance is exchanged or turned into transgressive and barbarian provocation. Western humanism is answered by inhuman acts or by a Hollywood-like medieval barbarism. Remember the ISIS staging those beheading with a sword, like in medieval time, or a fantasy of medieval time, etc. So gay rights, women's rights are changed and become exclusion of gay, forbidding other type of sexuality, oppression of women, etc. So you have literally, you see the movement. We could go across the board, item after item, but you have really an exchange, an inversion of what the West stands for and what the caliphate should stand for. That's a kind of interesting game. So army, occupation by the West, bombing, terrorism, targeting the public. Thank you.
So it sort of falls in my hands to make a few comments and then open it up to discussions. And these will be very few and abstract comments. These are two presentations which deal with the same topic from diametrically opposed sort of approach or theoretical approach, at least. What I find in Mark's ever-growing and ever-expanding research is a wonderful amount of information which still needs to be teased out. But one thing that I wish Mark could have emphasized more, and I know he does it in his actual research because I have read it, is the direct role of Western powers in perpetuating fundamentalists, the so-called fundamentalist Islam. We know by historical facts, as clearly displayed by evidence in British archives, that the Ibn Saud family, as Mark talked about it extensively, was funded, armed, and trained by the British intelligence. That is, without the British money, without the British support, And there was very good cause. It wasn't for evil intentions, actually. It was to create as many alternatives as possible in the Arabian Peninsula in case of the collapse or disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. And it came to a very good use because during the First World War, as the Ottomans chose the wrong side as far as the British were concerned and sided with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it became very clear that the British needed Arab allies. And in one case, they found this fellow, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who was running the most important religious city in the Islamic world, Mecca. But the other case was the Ibn Saud family, with whom they had a very long history. And this long history, by the way, continues with regular trips and visits by the British royal family to Saudi Arabia, where they dress in full Saudi garb, and quite frequent visits by the members of the Saudi royal family to London, where they have billions in terms of investment. So I would like, both of you to really address that while we constantly talk about Islamic fundamentalism as our enemy number one, we have also been funding Islamic fundamentalism and have been very closely allied with it. Now, moving from the British to our own situation, we are the ones who discovered oil in Saudi Arabia. We are the ones who actually provided full military security for the Saudi state since 1932, 1933. We are the ones who have an air base in Saudi Arabia. In case the Saudi royal family is destabilized, we can ship them out or we can land troops in Saudi Arabia. We are the ones who actually provided arms to the so-called Mujahideen in Afghanistan, who were fighting the Red Army, the communist, atheist, godless communists who had invaded Afghanistan. And through the Central Intelligence Agency, a huge amount of arms and funding went through Pakistan, and by the way, ISIS, which is the military intelligence of Pakistan, to the Mujahideen, who we were told were fanatical in terms of Islamic beliefs. But we were so obsessed with defeating communism that the enemy of the enemy was our friend. So who cares if they are fanatical? I always remember the words from Zbigniew Brzezinski, talking to the leaders of Mujahideen, those who forced veiling on women, those who discriminated based on gender and based on ethnicity and language. Go and kill these godless communists. This was a Democrat speaking to them, by the way, funding them, arming them. We did it for 8 years in Afghanistan, right? And after we left, then there was a force called Taliban. And guess who armed and funded them? It was the Pakistani intelligence services, which was receiving quite a bit of funding and arms from us. So all along, I'm kind of looking at it, and I'm asking myself, if they're so evil, why have they been so close to us? And for 8 years during the war between Iraq and Iran, while we were providing arms and funding to Saddam Hussein regime to contain the Iranian fundamentalists, the Shia fundamentalism, we now know that members of the Reagan administration were actually flying to Iran, providing spare parts, money. I remember Colonel Oliver North, for example, providing funding to that state-sponsored terrorist government, which we now call #1 sponsor of terrorism. For years, we were providing secret arms deal for Iran to make sure that the war between Iraq and Iran would continue. So I completely agree with your analysis, Mark, and this was a brilliant presentation, and thank you. But in some ways, I think we should also put on the table that while we complain about all this, right, during those years in Afghanistan when we were funding Mujahideen, right in front of us, there was this guy called Osama bin Laden. And the CIA was watching him. American intelligence services, other military intelligence and others were watching him. There was another guy, his name was Ayman al-Zawahiri, who represented the Islamic Jihad group in Egypt, right? And they were forming the Al-Qaeda, the base, right, which was in the beginning a building in Pakistan. And all along, our analysis was that Osama bin Laden was a good guy, right? Because he was killing Russians. And as long as, yeah, violence, so what? It's a war. As long as that violence was directed against the communists in the context of Cold War, he was a good guy. He only became the evil guy when he turned the weapons after his confidence was boosted because of our support and the defeat of Soviet Union against us, that he became the evil communist. So what I am suggesting is that there's quite a bit of hypocrisy here. And there's quite a bit of history that needs to be told in terms of how much we have, and I apologize for the verb, but that is the only verb, we have flirted with the fanatics and the Islamic fundamentalists as our allies when they were needed, right? And perhaps now we do not need them as much. The other comment on this that in some ways, I would say that when you talk to the people in the Middle East, you talk to people from North Africa, you talk to people from South Asia, they say that the biggest sponsor of terrorism is the United States. And people are always shocked. No, we oppose terrorism. Of course we do. We oppose violence and so on and so on. But they always ask, you know, let's ask ourselves the question, ISIS, right? As you mentioned correctly, Mark, you know, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIL as Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. And they always say, where is this ISIS coming from? I mean, when you see ISIS with all these brand new cars, you know, they have amazing taste in buying cars. Tanks, you know, machine guns, spare parts, and so on and so forth. There's always a question, is if we all got together and we went shopping, we couldn't buy one of them, right? So how do a group of terrorists, and Michel mentioned their age, young, disaffected, alienated, the majority of recruits, as Michel correctly pointed out, are coming from the back streets of London and Paris and Munich and Frankfurt. How did they get the money to go and buy this kind of thing? And while I agree with Michel that the rank and file, right, the soldier, is coming from disaffected, alienated, globalized world in which we live, the leadership is actually not poor at all. They're millionaire kids. They're upper middle class kids. Bin Laden was a rich, spoiled brat, right? Ayman al-Zawahiri was a physician and a surgeon coming from the upper middle classes. Mohammed Atta, who flew the first plane, was actually coming from very elite Egyptian family. To become a pilot, you have to go to school. To go to that kind of school, you have to have money, right? So they didn't come from the poor backgrounds. So the question is, of course, you know, when we get to ISIS, where is this money coming from? And I always ask, instead of going and reading the Quran, you know, chapter 5, verse 3, I say, oh, it says go and, you know, destroy your enemies. Please look at trail the money. And over in the case of, at least as you defined it, Mark, correctly, Sunni, you know, Orthodox Muslim terrorism, it always goes back to one place. It's called Saudi Arabia. Because no one else has the kind of money they have. Jordan, it cannot, even if it wanted to sponsor terrorism, it's too poor, its economy would go bankrupt, right? The billions of dollars which goes into building mosques, seminaries, religious schools, propaganda networks, and yes, training these fascistic, violent individuals who are coming from disaffected, alienated families is all coming from Saudi Arabia. And if you want to know how, is go to the latest analysis by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and the military intelligence. Because every time we actually establish ourselves militarily, let's say in Iraq or Syria, right? We go and get rid of ISIS. Our military intelligence people go with cameras and they film the entire area they have taken, right? They film the books they're using, they are filming the propaganda they're using, they are filming the classrooms they have set up for kids who have to be brainwashed and so on and so forth. And guess what? They don't have a publishing house. They don't have that kind of mechanism. You look at every piece of literature they use to brainwash and to bring their ideology of death and destruction and nihilism. They are a nihilistic group, right? And to the end, you find out that it's all Saudi printed, right? And when people say we are the sponsors of terrorism, it's not that United States is actually, United States buy billions of dollars worth of cheap petroleum. The money goes to the Saudi state, and the Saudi state puts it behind ISIS. And then we go and kill ISIS fighters. It's a circular kind of thing, right? That is, ISIS is not coming from Mars. ISIS is on the ground. So we have to ask, and I wanted you to comment this, why are the Saudis in the job, in the business of sponsoring terrorism? And who are they targeting? And I think we have agreed in our private discussions that a large part of it is we have a war in the Middle East, right? Between a coalition led by Saudi Arabia, billions of dollars behind it, which is countering the growing and expanding Iranian influence in the region, right? And to a large degree, much of this terrorism is sponsored in that context. What I am suggesting, therefore, is without wasting our time over Islam, it's very clear that there are concrete political, ideological, regional issues where the states are the direct sponsors of these kinds of terrorist attacks and terrorist organizations. And for that reason, I wanted you to comment on that. On Michel's part, and I will finish this because we can talk about this for such a long time. I agree to a large degree with Michel's analysis, and I think postmodernism does provide a very rich theoretical environment from which we can do this. But one issue that I think Michel's kind of talked about it, but was not directly there, is that this is really chickens coming home to roost, right? These are the byproducts of post-colonial reality. Algerian kids, why are they in France? Because at one point France was in Algeria, right? So second, third generation, now they are no longer Algerians in a way, they're French, right? They were born and raised in France. But they are the French who hate France, right? This is the perverse nature, right, of what post-colonialism have done, right? They're only Algerian in terms of an identity or a sub-identity. But for all practical purposes, they are French. They're born in France, they grow up in France. But then there are 70,000 Muslims who are in jail in France, right? That is, it is also the failure of the French system to integrate them. And they have become marginalized. They live in the suburbs, all these, how would you refer to them? Banlieue, right? The cement, so the poverty, alienation, unemployment, resentment, anger. And they have to go, you are completely correct, they have to go and experience on a daily basis the jouissance of the French bourgeoisie, right? Right? They have to supply the middle-class kids with pizza, right? And they have to go back to their cement buildings, and they cannot ever be integrated into the white French middle-class society. So in some ways, it's a direct result of alienation, anger, and disaffection. And ISIS is brilliant in this, evil brilliant, that they actually realized where the training and recruitment should take place. Prisons are the best place where you can recruit. There are tens of thousands of young Algerians, right, who have landed because of petty crimes and so on. And you're completely right. They don't even know how to read the Quran. They have no inkling of what Islam is. They don't even care about Islam. And I think that's where we need to make a distinction between Islam as a religion, which they are completely unaware of, with political Islam, which is the ideology of a nihilistic, alienated, radicalized group, right? So it is in jail that they were recruited. And it is I think one thing that we should sort of move toward is what can the French state, the French Republic do to tackle this issue? economically, socially, politically, and a Marshall Plan, perhaps, a massive investment in education, changing the Bolivarian, that is bringing them and making them part of the French society. This is not to justify their violence, but to say that there are fundamental socio-economic causes for the violence that we see. I'll shut up here. Thank you. Do you want to respond to some of this? Yeah? I know I put you guys on bad spot. That's my job.
Yeah, no, there's so much to respond to. I don't, is this on?
In the middle.
Now it's on. Yeah, why, you asked a lot of questions, all really good questions, and questions that I address in parts of what I'm trying to write. As to why the Saudis are paying, why we're paying the Saudis money to buy their oil and have done for a long time. We're not so much anymore. Under President Obama, we've cut back, I can't remember what, something like 33% or more than that of our consumption of Middle Eastern oil. But that money, you're right, goes to the Saudis, and because the Saudis and the Wahhabs have had this relationship for 200 years, that's a really intimate relationship, and it's been a struggle. It's not a democracy. Nobody gets elected over there, as far as I know. So the Saudi family has gone on since 1749, when Wahhab, they found each other. Marriages, the royal family has 7,000 people or something like that in it. They're the people that manage the money and manage the country, and the Wahhabs do, and it's a hard thing for us in a secular society to understand the power of faith. I mean, I suggest you can't go, unless you're Muslim, you can't go and watch the ritual at the Kaaba when they go and worship. But there are films of it that are rather phenomenal. The amount of passion, the amount of energy, all the things that we value in our art or in our public speakers or in our teachers, our lecturers, the commitment and passion is such that it's hard for us to understand that they want everybody to feel this way. I mean, the Wahhabi form of Islam is what I call an originalist form, like Justice Scalia was an originalist with the Constitution. They really want to go back to, they want to turn the clock back to 700, the first 3 generations after Muhammad, and to the way it was then. It's I think, a blindness, but it's a commitment that I don't think you can change their minds. And their effort, the reason they put money into Afghanistan, put money into Pakistan, put money into ISIS, into Zarqawi when he was in Iraq, they finance all of that is because they do believe that there are 2 ways out of this life, and that is either to convert everybody to Islam and kill the ones that don't, or to bring, and they say this in their literature, and I really believe that they believe it's true, to bring the West, Rome they call it, because that's what it is in the literature, that's who it was in the past, to bring Rome to them in the little town of Dika, I can't pronounce it, in Syria, where on the plains of Armageddon, where Jesus will rise up and the Mahdi will come, and between Jesus and the Mahdi, they will kill all the infidels, and the world will come to an end, and they will rise to paradise and heaven. It's about death, as Michel said. Death is a consummation devoutly to be wished. And that's, I think it's that simple.
Michel, you want to go?
Yes, quickly, because I would like the audience to. Yes, I address what you say, but it's time. I couldn't cover it all. But you're right. Globalization, religion. Lacan said that religion are going to come back in the 21st century. He said that in 1980 when he saw the demise of communism, socialism as alternatives. So without globalization, my point is that you wouldn't have this extreme form. You have ideology, religion. Wahhabism is a extreme religion. It's like the fundamentalist Christian in the West, right? Perhaps more, I don't know, but it's kind of symmetric. Without globalization, remember globalization, satellite, commercialization, you showed the world covered by Coca-Cola, science, etc. Pornography through satellites invade the whole world. So why wouldn't you expect some extreme reaction? It's kind of logical. When you have a system which pretends and makes and says, I am the answer to your existential problem, I will enrich you, follow me, you are going to have extreme reaction, especially when the system is espoused by everybody, by all the states, by all the elite in the world. So in a way, it's logical. What else would you expect, right? The whole world to espouse globalization and like sheep and say thank you, whatever, right? So in a way, it's what I said, globalization brings about those extreme forms that we call terrorism.
So, yeah, go ahead.
No, and Manifest Destiny was a big thing when the Europeans came over here and came and took the culture away and the lives away from the Native Americans, from the Indians that lived here. But we still think that way. We still think that if you're a white man, you have rights over anybody who happens to be in your way. Women, African Americans, Mexicans, people of color. I mean, Frantz Fanon has a good point in The Wretched of the Earth. And it's what the white race is terrified of right now, that they'll become extinct, which biologically, they need to become extinct. Biology dictates that they need to breed and interbreed and become stronger with other species, other races. But we don't pay much attention to science, the people that make decisions, because they're interested. Those people seem to be interested in getting their hair combed correctly.
All right, so time for questions or comments, and there's a microphone there. If not, you just want to ask your question, and then I would repeat it, please. Yes, please. Why don't you use the microphone? Everybody can.
ISIS has,
Yeah,
well,
good.
ISIS has taken credit for many of the acts of terrorism that have involved the bombing of mosques, that have killed so many other Muslims. I really don't understand, or I just wondered what your feedback on the psychological basis that you are trying to establish an Islamic State, and yet you're killing people who are Muslim. Is there any kind of feedback you could give me to understand that?
Well, yeah, I apologize. I tended to focus on terrorism, terrorist acts that have happened in the United States, and there have been so many, many, many more, and many more deaths, terrorist acts in the Middle East, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, Muslim on Muslim. The Sunni-Shia conflict goes back to 632 when Muhammad died, and they tried to decide who would be the next leader of this rather, by that time, pretty large group of people. Sunni hate the Shia, Shia hate the Sunni. It's too long a story to go into why they do it. I'm not sure that I completely understand. When you're pissed off and you just want to kill something because it hurts, you kill whoever's close to you. I mean, I think that's, again, too simplified, but I think that's part of the reason why you get so much Muslim on Muslim.
I tend to disagree, and I beg to differ on this. I think we have a tendency to broaden, generalize. Shia, Sunni, they hate each other. I mean, That's a little bit of, kind of the Western media, when we want to overgeneralize and make these huge categories of people. Yes, Christians hated each other, Catholics and Protestants, that, holy wars and so on and so forth. I think we have to be far more careful and be very concrete in terms of how this violence takes place. In case of ISIS, ISIS has killed many more Muslims than you can ever imagine. I mean, in comparison to people they have killed in the West, it's minute, in terms of the terrorism. And a large part of it is their nihilism. They don't believe in any system. They're not there to create a new system. They're there to destroy the existing system. So whoever, and it doesn't really matter whether they're Muslims, Christians, and Jews, they capture a Jordanian Sunni Orthodox Muslim who speaks the same language as they do, who follows the same religion. What did they do with him? They put him on a cage and they set him on fire, right? So this is not the ideology of Arab nationalism or even an Islamic form. It's a completely new form. And I think as we were talking and sort of discussing it this morning, I think the humble opinion, the humble decision, or the humble statement should be on our part to say it's very complex and I don't know the answer exactly. But what I do know is that they believe that all forms of governmental structures in the Islamic world, whether they are Sunni or Shia, whether they're Iranian or Turkish or Arab, whether it's the state of Israel, they're all unacceptable, right? The entire political system has to collapse, right? That's what actually makes them so attractive to the people Michel talked about. They have really replaced, in some ways, the revolutionary left of 60s and 70s and 80s, right? And with the collapse of radical socialism, radical Marxism, they are the show in town, right? Which attracts the younger people who are after a revolutionary, anti-imperialist, anti-West, anti-governmental sort of structure. That's why they are recruiting all these disaffected elements. There is also the question, I agree with Mark to this degree, that they are very upset with US intervention in Iraq, with US intervention in Afghanistan. And of course, what they see coming from this Wahhabi, Saudi, Islamic kind of fanatical interpretation, they see the expansion of Iranian power, right? And they consider Iranians, being non-Arabs, as the principal enemy of the Saudi state, the Wahhabi Islam. So anywhere they find any trace of Iranian influence, the Shia in Iraq who are backed by Iran, the Kurds in northern Iraq who are backed by Iran, the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, which is backed by Iran. They see the enemy, right? And of course, they also find Kurds, for example. These are Yazidi Kurds, in northwestern Iraq. They're not even Muslims. They come from this ancient sort of semi-Iranian sort of tradition, pre-Islamic religious beliefs. They consider them as people who should be eliminated and completely destroyed. And this is why in every sort of situation, when they see something not fitting, a monolith, right, a globalist sort of project, they always revolt against it, and they go after it, and they destroy it, and they kill it. But that is why, and this is a very important question you raised, that is why we should not make the mistake, as it's constantly made in the media, of mixing ISIS and Al-Qaeda with Hamas among the Palestinians, Hezbollah in Lebanon. This Hezbollah, yes, it's an Islamic group fighting in Lebanon, but Hezbollah is a national Lebanese organization which is fighting for domination over Lebanon, right? Hamas wants an independent Palestinian state. ISIS is a globalist. It's completely different in its nature. It's a worldwide network of nihilists who want to destroy Western systems, Middle Eastern systems, any form of existing government, to create this fantasy, and Michel described it very well, this caliphate which has never really existed in the ideal form, other than maybe the first few days of Muhammad in Medina, as Mark mentioned. That even didn't exist. But it's a romantic, it's a utopian, it's a fantastical sort of idea, which of course they are now trying to create it in Raqqa. You were asking for Raqqa, which is in Syria, which is of course is melting right in front of them as Iraqi and Syrian forces are getting close to it. It's going to melt down, but that is the dream. That's the fantasy dream that they are working with. Yes, of course.
A quick add. Yes, the ideologues of ISIS, they would oppose anything or anyone who opposes the caliphate, Muslim or Christian, doesn't matter, as long as you oppose the idea of the caliphate. And also the ideologues of ISIS, there is a psychotic structure. They think they are the voice and the instrument of God. So when you think you are the voice of God, you become extremely intolerant or anything else, right? I mean, I don't know if that makes sense. But.
Yes, please.
Yeah, but you are, I hope I'm going to be able to talk loud enough.
This is
What
my-
you are describing, Merda, it's an absolute.
You want to take one?
It's an absolute irrationality, right? It's the realm of you know, she said any system, any organization, any social patterns that you might find, that's you know, they're doomed to be destroyed. So it's not only rational, but it's also self-destructive. We also know that in the times that we live today, like, you know, nationalism is not going to even start addressing, even, you know, even though we are seeing like the signs of, you know, nationalism here in the United States, the Brexit, and, you know, God knows what's going to happen on Sunday in France. Mm-hmm. But so where is like that, where can this like seed to start like thinking from another place, from a place in which like some, you know, rational position can go back to the, you know, even to keeping like the human race in this planet.
You mean how to reinvent your universal solidarity which goes beyond religion and nation?
Yeah, that would, you know, I like your phrase. Yeah.
I think Zizek speaks about it.
Yes.
I think you have to go with, try to see what thinkers, global thinker like Zizek says, and he believes like the left would return one day transformed, having absorbed its own contradiction, and but nobody has any, that I know of, there's no solution right now. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I think it's the crisis of the post-ideological, post-capitalist society. You know, you just don't, you know, it was much easier. Gorbachev said one time, half joking, he said, you're constantly attacking Soviet Union, you know, communism as represented. We're going to collapse and you're going to miss us, you know. And because, you know, the bipolar Soviet versus US was actually very easy to handle, right? It's bipolar. There are capitals. One is Moscow. The other is Washington, D.C. There is the Warsaw Pact versus the NATO. You know, it's all taken care of in some ways. It had it was antagonistic, but it had its own logic, right? And now that it has collapsed, right, the centers of power are no longer a Winter Palace, a capital city. It's just moving. And I think to some degree, when you have these ideological constructs which have collapsed, it's very difficult now. And I respect Zizek a lot, but in this case, I'm completely opposed to, because that's a form of idealism for me. I think to have that kind of, I don't know, progressive level. It's also kind of thinking, you know, a little bit more idealistically in a kind of a cafe among a group of intellectuals. What we are really dealing with is a highly globalized post-capitalist world in which no ideology has been able to actually bring that kind of unity among movements and organizations. I mean, you even see it, in the United States to some degree. It's atomized, right? There are those who are, talking about, issues regarding with this group, with this community, so on and so forth. At times, they come together to organize demonstrations, but really, there is no real platform which unifies them under one umbrella in an ideological sense of the word.
Well, maybe,
Except religion. That's why the religious is coming back so strongly.
Yeah, but religion, we are again, falling into the irrational. And, and we need like some sort of rationality. I know that, thinking about like the United Nations sounds like, obsolete. But on the other hand, if you think that the United Nations has like the voices of, small members that don't have like these enormous vested interests. So I think that would be like a forum in which some sort of rationality of, equilibrium in this world could be like a space where that dialogue.
What I can tell you is that when you read the literature of these groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so on and so forth, the response, I'm not suggesting I know how they would respond to it, but they actually say that the globalization and the global system that has been created, and of course, they always blame the United States and European Union as being the architect of this new globalized world. They always refer to this as the most irrational thing that has been created, right? Why should I be condemned to watch your pornographic, McDonald-based culture, right? I hate it, right? And as long as this is the dominant culture that you are imposing on me through internet, through your movies, through your culture, which is highly hedonistic and utilitarian and individual-based, I have the right to lash back and tell you, I hate your culture, and since I don't have the power to create my counterculture, I will destroy what you have created. That's what you say. Yes, please.
Well, I guess I just noticed that both the most disaffected part of ISIS has a very poor relationship with women, with the feminine, and there is this need for the other, need to have the other. And thinking about the James Baldwin movie, I Will Not Be Your Nigger, that need for the other, can you address how that, maybe that the path out is to eliminate or transcend the need for the other, and that women as the other might have something to do with the path out. Not that we are the answer, but there is even in our current president such a poor relationship with any kind of understanding of that side of things. So I don't know if it's rationalism, but some kind of balance. If you can think of that as a possible, that the other and death create this dualism.
Well, it's why I tried to, but I didn't have time to expand on it, but that's a good question. You have to see that the other is, it's impossible to, very fast. You have the mother from 1 to 2 to 3 to the child. So you have a mother with the O in between parentheses, you have the other of the mother, right? So that's the base of any society. You have the incest taboo, that cannot be suppressed. And then the otherness is constitutive of the formation of subjectivity. You capture your image as other in the mirror and you appropriate it with a name, etc. Now, what you are saying is that in a psychotic situation, there's no way, and men, I'm speaking about men now, not women, men cannot access the mother, they cannot expect it's forbidden, but they cannot access the other of the mother or the women without the help of a tool, which is called the paternal metaphor, which makes sense of that dimension, motherness, femaleness, feminineness, women. Now, if that paternal metaphor, which is a mediation, and it's unconscious, is not available to you through different means, then you have very strange logic. And in ISIS, in all these specificities, which are ultra-religious, there's no access to the otherness of the mother or women, except through the bar, the veil, being framed, staying at home, very limited role, as if there's an impossibility, if you want. That's one of the weakness, I think, and that's why the Muslim terrorism or jihadism is doomed, because you cannot function like that forever. But so what you are saying, how to bring otherness as women back into the system. In order to do that, you have to leave your psychosis behind. That means to have another structure, which takes psychoanalysis, which takes a lot of work. It's impossible practically. So, but we have to look at our guilt, the way the West has favored that, directly or indirectly, right? But it's not otherness as such which is a problem. It's the way otherness is processed by the ego without the necessary tools, without the necessary psychic tools. Does that answer you, or?
Let me also suggest this. I think, again, maybe, where I would go as far as Mark's and Michel's presentation is look at this also in a more concrete term. Yes, there is an element. First and foremost, I think one can say that the discrimination against women, this violence, at times, in a general sense, is broadly defined as something Islamic, right? That it's embedded in the teachings of Islam. Islam discriminates against women. And this has been used, and there are very strong elements of truth about it. However, as far as I'm concerned, it's not enough. It's a good starting point, to bring it up. But then in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as was practiced, it was the same. In fact, Islam in 7th century allowed women to inherit, to file for divorce, to testify in a court of law. I mean, I think all Christian and Jewish scholars who have studied Islam would argue that it was an improvement in the 7th century to what Judeo-Christian legal system had created. But it's based on a discriminatory approach toward women. Women are second class. They're not even citizens. They're subjects of the state, right? So that's part of but I think once you get into that, it's very dangerous to just stay there, right? So Islam, it's condemned and so on. But I mean, let me give you a couple of examples. It is, Afghanistan, right? And Mark is working on this, and he has written quite a bit. So you have a society which has been at war, right? At least since late 1970s, right? It's a permanent state of war. Afghanistan, first the Marxists takes over, then there's a civil war, then the Soviet Red Armies, and then for 10 years, there 14,000 Soviet soldiers are killed. Over 1 million Afghans are maimed or killed or injured. Several million escaped to Pakistan and Iran as refugees. So the society has been in absolute upheaval. So what happens in this case is that there are millions of refugees, Afghans, and millions of orphans, right, who are born and raised in these refugee camps. And the common characteristic of these refugee camps is the child has never seen a woman, has never seen a mother, right? Afghan culture, in fact, the tradition is when you enter a house, you kiss the hand of the mother, right? And you are kissed by your mother and so on and so forth. When you see where Taliban recruited its soldiers from the young refugee camp boys, right? Never saw their mothers, never had any sisters, even did not know how to interact with women, right? And you add on top of this Wahhabi, right, fundamentalist, very Quranic-based ideology, and then you unleash them through ISI, the Pakistani military intelligence, against your own society. So the only way they know how to deal with women is domination and discrimination, right? So in some ways, it's the dysfunctionality, right, of a society, a war-torn society, which has lost any kind of family structure, right? These are single boys being born and raised and brainwashed in madrasas. No father as a symbol and no mother. Now, you look at the Qureshi, you know, these guys in France, very interesting, similar, striking similarities, right? The father sort of disappeared somewhere. They actually were brought up in orphanage homes, right? And people right away say, well, a lot of people are brought up, I mean, they don't become terrorists. But there is no mother either. And there is always this sense that they were hiding the fact that she might have had become a prostitute, which only adds to the hatred of what French society has done to an Algerian Islamic family structure. They destroyed us, they defamed us, right? They first conquered and colonized our country. Now our family structure has collapsed. And therefore, there is this hatred for women, but there is also hatred against French society for victimizing them. Right? So in each case, you have to be very careful in terms of how it shows its ugly head and how it's demonstrated. But having said all this, then you have, I mean, last night and this morning on the radio, you have this country we call still mistaking Iran. No, I didn't run, it's Iran, you know. We still have a hard time even naming the countries correctly. So what has happened? 70% of the population is below 30 years old. 57% of university graduates are women. These are surgeons, doctors, nurses, teachers, professors, scholars, researchers. This is incredible. There is a gender revolution at the same time taking place in the Islamic world, which of course Fox, MSNBC, and CNN do not have time to cover this because they have to cover much more important things like Kim Kardashian's latest party, you know. So for that reason, we don't have time for the truth too much in the entertainment-based media. So what happens as a result, there is a revolution. And if you want to know why the Islamic regime in Iran is so repressive, it's because the women are empowering themselves. It's because there is a movement. If there was no movement, they would not be so insecure about themselves. And every time this population has been given the right to express itself, they have dismissed, denounced, and called for the overthrow of the Islamic regime in Iran, which tells you their politics is very anti-state. And the more educated they are, the more sophisticated they become. First, they marry much later. They don't need a man in their lives. Many more single women. Economic empowerment has taken, education, and they don't need a government with an Islamic fundamentalist ideology. So we tend to also forget that while all this ugliness is taking place, there's a great deal of movement in the so-called, quote-unquote, right direction, right, in direction of an emancipation project. But that emancipation project needs global awareness, education on our part, and an awareness that they are our sisters in this struggle. Not everybody in the Islamic world is veiled and sitting at home not doing anything. There are a lot of them in surgery rooms, in classrooms, in government buildings, and so on and so forth. And there is an ongoing fight for women's rights, therefore, in the Islamic world, believe it or not.
Yes, and another way of adding to your question is, what is it in globalization which brings about an archaic dimension of women? That's another way which needs a different approach. And also, instead of the other, I would say there's self-hatred. Those young theories, there's self-hatred. So the other is a much more problematic relation, but this self-hatred is typical. There's no, the ego is destroyed. There's only, they go back to the primary, well, anyway.
Thank you very much.